Hey guys, how you doing? It's so good to see you. It is April the 3rd. Did you have fun on the 1st? Did you read my post? You're saying what post? Well, it's on my own personal blog, carlkreisman.com. Check it out. You can't miss it. So, we are heading into week 8, right? I think it's week 8. We're talking right now about the Renaissance. What I think, and I told you from my past in college, the perhaps most biggest thing from world history, or one of the biggest. Certainly an epic of time. And people argue how long. So I would say probably 150 years. Certainly Petrarch, so middle 1300s. And that, of course, is that darkest of the dark centuries. So, you know, it's maybe not fair to, I don't know, it's just kind of this overlap. Here's this dark century, you know, 100 Years' War, plague, Mongolian invasion before, the plague and the war. And then the Avignon papacy, the destruction of the church edifice, which actually is a good thing. It's to some degree an attack at the root of what Constantine built. Remember, we talked about Constantine and where the church goes, kind of drunk on the excesses of power, is far, far away from what Jesus and the disciples, actually wanted, what Jesus actually said. So, in any case, so those four things, destruction. But in the middle of that, of course, is when Petrarch shows up, starts writing. Boccaccio starts writing, following Petrarch. So you could argue it starts 1350s. It might be better to say it starts at Petrarch's death, so towards the end of the 1300s, as it builds up steam through his influence into the 1400s. So maybe 100 years. Regardless, massive, massive. And the way I described it to you, the way I like to think of it, is that it is a revolution of revolutions. So again, told you this already, pick a field, pick something, and I promise you in this period there was rapid, massive change. It's exactly like what we're going through now. I've told you that. We're alive in the third time like this, in my opinion, in world history. And future historians, when get to 3100, year 3100, they're going to look back on this period and probably start 1900s, maybe with the atomic bomb, 1950. It may be later, right? It might be only the internet age, the computer age, so 1980s. But somewhere in there, and we're seeing the rapid change, right? So if the Renaissance was 150 years, so 1350 to 1500, something along those lines, certainly ours may be, future historians may look back and say, wow, actually, we want to start here and go to there, and it's 150 years, and we may go back to some of the great inventors of the early 1900s as kind of the Petrarch of the age. It's hard to know, all right? But in any case, massive, massive change, right? So one of the most, well, there's two that really come out, well, see, it's so big, right? So you have, one of the most impactful that we won't really talk a lot about, but you could do an assignment on, is a possibility of the Exploration Revolution. Exploration, this is the thing we talk about in AMH 2010, start of American history. Exploration Revolution dynamically changed or caused largely because of the Renaissance, right? But there's also the Scientific Revolution, which we're going to talk about in our latter, I think week 9. You'll have an assignment, maybe a discussion, I think just an assignment, right? But we're going to talk about it because it's massive, right? You bring in Copernicus and Brahe and Kepler and then Galileo, obviously, leading ultimately to Newton. Woo! Massive, massive change, right? So it's big. It gets its own little name, just like the Exploration Revolution. But those are really birthed from the Renaissance. Well, the one that's perhaps the most impactful doesn't even use the word Renaissance in it, or revolution, but it really is the Reformation. The Reformation is really a religious revolution, or a Christian revolution, or a revolution against the church or in the church. But it's a child of the Renaissance. All right, so I want you to know it that way, that it's merely a product of the Renaissance. And how? What is the Renaissance? Remember, the Renaissance is this idea of recapturing of knowledge. The human has value, leading to humanism. Humanism is a child or a way of thinking of the Renaissance, but don't limit yourself there. But what really happened, remember, Petrarch went looking to make his writing better. As he goes looking to make his writing better, he finds ancient documents. He's just trying to be a better writer, philology, grammar, rhetoric, right? But as they do, they unearth knowledge that didn't change how people thought about art, military technology, exploration, building boats. They went back to this ancient knowledge, and in government and law and writing and poetry, everywhere. Erasmus does the same thing. And you're going to get a chance to look at the Northern Renaissance, look at Erasmus, his influence. Now, the Northern Renaissance is different than the Southern Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance. You're going to look at how, right? In that, there's this sense of, what did the Renaissance say? Well, how did the ancients do it? 1,000, 1,500 years ago, what were the Greeks and Romans doing? What were they saying? How did they write? How did they think? Right? Same thing happens here. Erasmus and others say, wait a minute. Well, I know the church is today, here in 1400, 1450, 1500. You're going to want to look at Wycliffe, John Wycliffe, and John. It's spelled like Jan, but it's John. Jan Hus, right? From Bohemia, modern-day Prague, modern-day Czech Republic, right? Very near to where Luther is. These three, you can go Wycliffe, Hus, Luther, and see a connection there, right? So how did they think? Well, Hus and Wycliffe in particular, and from Wycliffe in England to Tyndale, William Tyndale, they're going to begin to put the Bible into the language of the common people. But they don't want to just go off the Vulgate, which is, the Vulgate's fine. It's not like it's messed up. It's not like somebody's don't listen to anybody telling you that somebody's added things to the Bible. That's just simply not true historically. Even if I wanted it to be true, it's just not true. We can't say that. The Bible is really one of the most amazing, historically accurate books of all antiquity. There's just no way around that, okay? However, it still wasn't as pristine as it could have been. And Erasmus says, well, you know what? Let's go back to the ancient documents. Let's go back to the original. Can we find original documents? So just like in every other field, they went digging. And Erasmus found it and began to rewrite, basically, the Greek, from the Greek, the scholar's version at that point. And again, it wasn't far off, but there were some changes, right? And from that, Luther, well, really Wycliffe, Tyndale, Huss, and then Luther, these guys began to really dig in to this material and begin to ask questions. Make sure you realize Luther doesn't start the first reforming of the church. Luther's just the first one to be successful. Remember, we hinted at this. I mentioned it once. When you go back to Constantine, it's almost as if the moment all that dust settles and people realize what's happened, you get this press for reform. It's the beginning of the monastic movement. It is not coincidental that these kind of ancient church fathers, as they were known, went out into the desert. They left, in essence, the trappings of power to go and pursue what Jesus really actually said. And when you look at what people like Benedict did and others, when they're establishing religious orders, they were in essence setting up some form of alternative to the official church. Now, note what happens here. The church ends up with two possible solutions that they will put into practice for 1,000 years. And to some degree, you might argue to this day, right? One is they go to crush the reform, right, through death mostly, sometimes through ostracism, through exclusion, right? The other is they try to co-opt it, right? They want to bring it in. So with the early church desert fathers, there's a sense of crushing them or ignoring or excluding. But with Benedict, it was so popular and touched a chord. In other words, Benedict was saying, hey, look, that's not what Jesus really said. All that power stuff, all that money, that's not right. Right? So with that, they said, well, we're going to co-opt that. And they brought in this sense of the church has approved the Benedictine orders. And then as you go forward from there to the Dominicans and to the Ursulines and eventually the Franciscans, they're all basically brought in under the umbrella of the church. But there are other groups. Cluny was also co-opted. But then there were other groups, you know, the Poor Men of Lyon, the Waldensians. And when you get here to the period of the 1400s, you get to Wycliffe and Huss, you see this sense of, we're going to crush it. They won't let it be co-opted because those guys were saying some pretty blatant things, such as, hey, look, papacy, not in the Bible, sorry. The power you guys have, not in the Bible either, sorry. And they're really arguing from the sense of the ancient documents. So Luther then comes in just as one of several over this 1,000 years. But he's the first to be successful in not being co-opted and not being crushed. And Luther, to some degree, pops the bottle. Now, at the same time Luther's doing this, in the Swiss Alps, you've got Ulrich Zwingli, who's doing the same thing, independent of Luther. So you have two guys happening at once. The church can't handle it because of what has happened in the Avignon papacy. So make those connections. Man, there's so much in the Reformation. I love it because of how it changes society, how it gets back to what the Bible actually said. I mean, as a Christian myself, I love this sense of going back to what the Bible actually said. You've got the two assignments, you've got the discussion. You're really close to the end of the term. Hang tight. You're doing great. Let me know if you have any questions. The final exam's already open. Go look at it. All right. Talk to you soon.